I appreciate you joining me for part 7 of how to install granite kitchen countertops on a budget. Have you seen parts 1 through 6? The first job that I want to attempt today is filling in this seam where the two pieces of granite meet. I'm a little nervous because I've never done this before, and my success or failure will be posted on the internet for all to see. The industry accepted product for filling in this gap is something called knife grade epoxy with a colorant added to match the surrounding stone. I couldn't find a local supplier for this product, and I did find it on Amazon, but it was about $70 for a can. I'm both in a hurry and on a budget with this project, so I decided to improvise. What I decided to use is something called 5-minute epoxy, 2500 psi strength. That sounds pretty sturdy, and it comes pre-colored cream. The power just went off. Darkness befalls us. Anyway, it's cream colored, and I think that color will go with the granite well enough that it won't be too noticeable when it's done. So the first thing I'm going to do to prepare this seam for the epoxy is tape on each side of it. That way when I apply the epoxy to the seam, it will just get in the seam and on the granite just to the side of the seam instead of all over the countertop. I've finished taping on both sides of the seam, and now I'll mix up some epoxy. Now we mix. All mixed up. Now I will apply. Test in an inconspicuous place first. Ha ha ha. I think I will first just dab it on with my stick. And I need to work fast because I think it dries quickly. Once I get the epoxy down the entire length of the crack, I will squeegee it in with some cardboard or something. Okay, I've got all of the epoxy in the seam there. I think now I'll just use this plastic container that the epoxy came in to wipe it down. And maybe I will reapply and do it again just to make sure it goes down in there where it should be. I need to hurry, time is ticking. It's already starting to get thicker. This worked pretty good. When I scraped it, it went right back into the mixing tray. Okay, now it's really starting to set up, so I better give this a wipe and then call it good. So that's what the seam looks like with the epoxy pushed into it. I wonder if I have enough to do this little guy here too. Enough time? Probably not. What the heck? I live dangerously. No tape. No time for tape. See if I do both seams with just the one container of epoxy, I can return the other one. There, just in time. Before it dries completely, I'm going to remove this tape. In theory, anyway. It's been about 3 minutes since I've applied this goop, and I'm going to try to cut some of it off around this other seam before it dries completely. Yeah, that's a good idea, I think. So there's the vertical seam, my impromptu seam, and here is the main seam. And I'll let this dry for another few minutes, and then I will scrape it down with a razor blade so that it is level with the granite surface. My plan for finishing this seam is to use a razor blade and scrape off any excess epoxy so that the level of the epoxy in the gap is at the same height as the surrounding countertops. It's been about 30 minutes since I've removed the tape from the sides of this seam, and it's not quite dry yet. I need to make sure the epoxy is completely dry before I try to scrape it. So, in the meantime, while I wait for the epoxy to dry, I'm going to seal up these corner seams in the granite. To do this, I'm just going to use standard, clear, 100% silicone sealant. And that completes the silicone treatment. Let's look at our seam again. I've discovered something. The epoxy isn't quite dry yet, but I can get the razor blade under it and kind of shave it off like this. And I think I'll go down the entire seam like this and then let it dry completely and scrape this way. Epoxy noodles, anyone? I've finished scraping this seam and I'm pleased with the results. Unfortunately, this seam didn't fare as well. I think that because these surfaces are polished, the epoxy didn't adhere as well in this seam as it did in this seam right here. So what I'll do is I'll just dig out all this epoxy and replace it with a bead of silicone. It seems that the seams are done. The next thing I want to work on is the kitchen sink. It's placed in its proper location, however, it's not hooked up. So we need to remedy that situation. The first thing I'm going to do is take the sink out and attach the faucet. I'm using the same fixture that was in the previous sink. I've just put in a little bit of elbow grease to polish it up, and I think it looks pretty good. I've put some silicone on the underside of this fixture to seal it against the top of the sink. These little plastic nuts secure the faucet to the sink. The faucet is now installed in the sink, and the next thing I want to do is install the strainers into the bottom of the sink. I'm reusing the original strainers from the previous sink, and I've polished them up with some of the fine grit sandpaper that I purchased for polishing the granite. Just to show you what can be done with some of these grimy old fixtures, here's a before picture of the garbage disposal strainer, and here's how it looks after a few minutes worth of elbow grease. I've installed the drains in the bottom of this sink. If you're curious about the procedure for removing and installing one of these garbage disposal sink strainers, you can see that video right here. I did make one mistake when installing these. I accidentally installed this one right here and this one right here. Evidence. But it's corrected now, and I'm ready to place the sink in the cutout. Before I do that though, I need to run a bead of silicone around the whole underside of this sink so that when I place the sink where it goes, there will be a good seal right here so water can't get past. I finished applying the silicone around the rim of the sink here, and now I'm going to place it in its spot. I want to place it as close to its final location as possible, because once that silicone touches the granite, I don't want it to move very much. Now that the sink is resting in the cutout, I need to use these little clips to secure it on the underside. The sink is now secured to the countertop. I used these clips that were included with the sink to fasten it, and you can see them right here. A few of them I had to modify, like this one I had to cut it. You can see the difference because space was limited. The next thing I need to do is attach these drain lines. As you can see, the new sink doesn't line up exactly with the old plumbing. Luckily, these types of pipes are adjustable, and I think I'll be able to make it work with the pieces that are already here. I'm making some progress on my under the sink plumbing. I've connected the garbage disposer, the dishwasher discharge line, and the faucet supply lines. I ran into a small challenge, however. This sink sits a little bit farther to the right than the old sink, so the original P-trap doesn't line up correctly. To remedy this situation, I've called in my emergency plumbing tote, and I have found a series of pipes that I should be able to use to remedy the situation. So I will install those momentarily. Perfect. And just like that, I have a kitchen sink. And that'll do it for this segment. Next time, I'll finish up the project, and I'll also go over the total cost of all the materials I used on this job and an approximation of the time that I had to devote to it. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Thanks for watching.